say before?
No, I'm sorry. I got the email, but I couldn't click on the link for some reason. I don't know.
Okay.
It wasn't working.
We're here. It's all good.
Yeah, but thank you for resending me the link. That really worked.
Okay. Excellent. I'm ready.
All right.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a conversation investigating the role that gratitude plays in our lives. This conversation stems from a developing research project undertaken by Concordia University public scholar and doctoral candidate in marketing, Tanya Singh. To unravel some of the complexities associated with the concept of gratitude, Tanya is joined today by philosopher Jing Hu and doctoral candidate in experimental psychology, Alexa Ruel, who's here in Fourth Space with me. Hi. We are coming to you, speaking of Fourth Space, we are coming to you live from Concordia University's Fourth Space, which is located on unceded indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At Fourth Space, we facilitate daily activities that focus on what Concordia community members and their collaborators are working on, especially in terms of process-based research. So to that end, we're very pleased to host this podcast conversation, or what will become a podcast conversation. Okay, that's it for me. I want to hear this. I want to get started. So I'll pass it over to you, Tanya, for an introduction.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that really generous introduction and really orienting the discussion in the right direction. So as you already mentioned, this conversation is sort of centered around discussing the role gratitude plays in our daily lives, in our society, and how it can sort of help us or hinder us during times of crises. And that's exactly the kind of thought process that led me to asking the question, and the question which sort of led to the project that I'm working on right now with my dissertation supervisor, Caroline Rue, who's a professor, associate professor at the John Molson School of Business. So, and we have very preliminary findings, so I'm not going to really stress on the findings that we have, but in a sense, I think the conversation is going to be basically an open-ended discussion on, what gratitude means and what kind of downstream consequences gratitude can have. And so one of the downstream consequences of gratitude is known to be reciprocity. So when you experience gratitude, you sort of feel this need to reciprocate either to the benefactor who has bestowed this act of kindness towards you, or you sort of reciprocate in a downstream kind of way. And so we basically wanted to look at if resource scarcity, because that's the research interest of my supervisor and also my research interest. So we basically wanted to ask this question of whether resource scarcity can interact with this sort of reciprocity that results from gratitude. And basically the idea would be that if you are feeling sort of constrained resource-wise, so if you're financially constrained or time constrained, and then someone, lends you their time or lends you their money, you might, because of this act of gratitude, feel this need to reciprocate. And because your resources are already constrained, this might actually have a negative impact on your overall well-being, because you might feel like you are not in a position to reciprocate, and this might make you feel worse or make you feel like your resources are even more scarce. And so basically this is the kernel of the idea or the project that we are sort of working on currently. And we have some preliminary findings to suggest that gratitude can have negative consequences, especially for those who are already experiencing resource scarcity. So I've sort of explained to you what, my sort of interest in gratitude is, or how I came to gratitude, but I'd love to hear from Jing and also from Alexa how they perceive gratitude and what kinds of roles they think gratitude plays in our society, and other moral emotions like gratitude play in our society. So either of you, whoever wants to take the stage. I mean, I have some questions. I can also throw some questions at you. I guess maybe I'll throw a question at Alexa first. So what do we know, Alexa? And obviously, feel free to say no if you don't know the answer, but what do we know about the cognitive basis of gratitude? I mean, do we know what areas of the brain sort of fire when gratitude is being experienced? What do we know about that?
Yeah, I think, I think in psychology, gratitude is, it's studied quite a bit. It's a very complex concept, right? So I did some little research on it to find out how much do we really know about what gratitude is, and how is this touching on other psychological concepts. And what I found is that it's so complex that we're just starting to really understand the breadth of what gratitude involves at the psychological level. And it involves everything from like understanding basic emotion, empathy, to value judgment. So like, what is this worth? Can I return that worth? To other concepts like moral cognition. And when we look at what is happening at the neural level, so using things like fMRI, so magnetic imaging, we can really start to see, well, which areas of the brain are involved in when someone expresses or feels gratitude, and what does that mean for the concepts that we're touching on when someone feels grateful for something. So it's very, very complex. We can maybe dive into a little more of this later during the talk, but it goes from everything from like a basic recognition of emotion to this deeper process of deciding what the value is of something, and then what you're going to do about what you've received and how you feel about that. But there's a lot, but also a little when it comes to understanding gratitude from a psychological angle.
Yeah, I think I appreciate your answer, because I also went back and did some reading, and because I'm familiar with a certain type of gratitude that is often employed in marketing research, but there's such a breadth, as you mentioned, of gratitude research out there. And so when I started looking into it, it was really interesting how gratitude can be conceptualized, or has been conceptualized in psychology, as as an emotional response to a kind act. It can also be a generalized state. So basically a mood that you experience, a general appreciation for things around you. And it can also be a trait. So it's been conceptualized widely, sort of differently, and been used differently in different studies. And then even when it comes to reciprocity has been conceptualized in very different ways. So there's sort of direct reciprocity, which is sort of, A helps B and then B helps A. So it's sort of this direct, when you know the other person who the benefactor is, you sort of return the favor. But there's downstream reciprocity, which is that you help someone, and then that increases your reputation and the likelihood that someone else will help you. And there's also upstream generosity, which is sort of reciprocity, which is that A helps B, and then B goes on and helps another person, which is sort of how gratitude plays into this whole pro-social, the evolution of pro-sociality, or the evolution of altruism. And I guess on the subject of altruism, I want to know from Jing, Jing, what do moral philosophers have to say about gratitude? Like, what role does it play in sort of what place does it have in our lives?
So this is really interesting, especially to hear from the scholars in empirical research about how gratitude sometimes is measured and understood. So in philosophy, a lot of times we talk about it in a more fundamental and abstract way, right? So the good thing is that now we understand that, I'll start from the limitation, right? The limitation is that in philosophy, maybe we don't have a very hands-on understanding of, sometimes we see, gratitude failed to motivate something. Then it's very easy for us to say, hey, maybe it's not a reliable motivator. Or when we say, hey, gratitude is really, really important, but we can't really put a number to it of how important it is. But I think what philosophy is really great at doing, what ethics really great at doing, is that it really highlights the complexity of the whole phenomenon of gratitude and altruism and empathy. And especially like when you were mentioning the downstream reciprocity, right? So someone helps me, I don't think much of it. And many years later, I find myself to see someone else in a situation that I was in a few years before, and I help that person. So it's sort of like a bank that something was stored in me, and later on I were able to kind of repay. But that kind of repay is, on one hand, we all know it's a real and meaningful reaction. It can be really strong, and we are very familiar with it. But it's not reliable in the sense that we can't measure it in a lab setting. We can't say, hey, let's gather 10 people and then 20 years later and have them report back if this one instant where we gave them $100 each had any positive effect, right? So, and also I think there's one other thing is precisely the temporal limitation, which is very important in long-term emotions like gratitude or empathy. It can have a very, very long-term effect in shaping this person's character, in shaping this person's behavior down the road, instead of having an immediate effect. And I think the most fascinating part of this emotion is precisely that when it has an immediate reaction, even though sometimes it's reliable and we expect it to have an immediate reaction, it's very weak and flimsy when it's immediate. And then when it becomes a strong motivator, it's precisely when it's working in this mysterious and long-term way that it gets us, then it changes us and shapes us. Then it has a very dramatic effect. So I think that's one thing that I think philosophy and I might personally find really fascinating is precisely how sometimes almost mystically these emotions work in the long run, and not only just for ourselves, but also in fact other people, and then sometimes create a positive feedback loop, creates that lasts for generations. So so I thought that's something that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head with, how it really, philosophy equips you to sort of explore the complexity and the long-term features of sort of gratitude. And I now appreciate that a lot more. And as I was hearing you speak, I was also thinking about, how gratitude, even in the psychology literature, it has been noted that gratitude does strengthen social relationships. It sort of facilitates social bonding. And so there is this long-term, at least even though we have sort of temporal limitations and of what we can study, we've still established that gratitude does help to, sort of strengthen social relationships. And so I'm just sort of, I guess, thinking back to what you said about it's hard to measure the exact impact of gratitude. And I think I think even psychology research is just sort of starting to scratch the surface of what it might imply. So Alexa, do you have any follow-up comments or questions?
Actually, yeah, I was curious, or what came to mind from my perspective. So being a lifespan development researcher, when Jing, you spoke about, these temporal differences, what comes to mind for me is immediately this image of a young child, who maybe is getting a really cool gift from a parent or a relative or a friend. And there's like this immediate amazement. There's like this brief moment of gratitude that you see wipe across their face, and then it's gone. And then they're off running doing something else. And then you think about how as we age, then it's like in a younger adulthood or an older adulthood, we reflect back on these moments, and then you see the gratitude is a lot more, right? So kind of exactly what you're saying is that, you can probably think back to your childhood and think of a moment that you were really, really grateful for then, but you're only kind of expressing it now. Maybe you're only kind of telling that person, whoever the gratitude was directed towards, that you were really grateful for what they did for you back then. I think it's really interesting to think about, at least from my perspective, how the brain changes as we age and what that may say about why there's these changes too. So that was all I had to add there.
So Alexa, I think that's a really interesting point, precisely because it makes me think, is it always better to articulate that we're grateful or not? Because in a child's case, right, and also in a lot of cases, someone does something for us and we are very grateful and we're happy, but we do not necessarily articulate it. I know in Western tradition, a lot of times we're encouraged to, right? I'm grateful for this, I'm grateful for that. We're asked to reflect on them. But I also wonder sometimes if it's, because it also works sometimes in a way that if you don't articulate it, doesn't mean the emotional effect just disappear. It's still there. And if you don't articulate, maybe it can be shaped and built into something, else. Because once you articulate it, you formalize and, it give it a name, right? Give it a form. But I just wonder if there's any, what's your thought on that?
I think, so I don't really know much about, that per se, but I think there definitely are moments where maybe you are grateful, but you're not fully ready to express it yet, right? So if we think of it as a marriage between emotional processing, theory of mind, these value judgments, like it's all this happening at the same time. And I think sometimes if we were to maybe force ourselves to express it, it either wouldn't come out right, or we haven't fully processed everything that is gratitude from a cognitive or a psychological angle. And therefore, it's better maybe not to say anything just yet, right? Of course, there's some things that will be said without being said. So if someone offers you a really great gift and you're very grateful for it, I mean, you might smile. It might show right away that you're grateful for the gift, but you might not express anything verbally to the person who gave you that gift. And I think maybe that's just, part of the very complex cognitive process that is gratitude, and maybe it just takes that extra time, or maybe it wouldn't come out right, and that's why we don't always express it in the moment either. So I think, although I can't say exactly what it might be, I think the sheer complexity of it speaks for itself.
And also I wonder in certain cases, right? So if my friend treat me to a cup of latte, I'm very grateful, and it's very easy for me to say, oh, thank you so much, you shouldn't have, right? So those are very, particular, and then we're socialized to process them really fast and express that really, aptly. But there are things, for example, our partner do for us, our parents do for us, that we really are very grateful, and then we're too much in debt that we just can't start to put words into it. And we feel like if we start saying this, like, thanks for, bringing me up, and then, sacrificing your life, or to raise me up. I just starting to feel like the moment you start saying them and articulating them, you're losing the magnitude of the emotion that you're experiencing, and then the gratitude that you're actually harboring. So I know this is not very helping in the empirical aspect, because, you have to articulate and measure it some way. But I wonder if that's something that the empirical researchers have considered and then kept in mind.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but actually I want to flip the question and send it maybe back to Tanya. Is what comes to mind here is, like, when something is just such a big gift, or something you would be very, very grateful for, right? So you can imagine, instead of a friend offering you a coffee or a latte in the morning, that, a neighbor buys you a car, right? So something that has a lot more value, that's really, and then you might, you might really need the car, you might really be grateful for it. But I'm wondering what happens there, and maybe Tanya, you can speak a little more to that, is, what happens, or do you know what would happen, or what people feel when it's just like, it's too much of a gift? Is it just a process, like a delay in processing, or is it something else that makes us just feel like, ooh, this is not right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I would honestly, I don't know. I don't know if I have a definite answer to that question, but I think definitely if the gift far exceeds the expectations of the person, then there would probably be this question about, firstly, I think this reciprocity that we talked about, this sort of feeling of indebtedness that Jing was referring to, I think that would be really, really great, right? It almost to the point of like, do I even deserve this gift, right? So, at some point you have to sort of maybe question, like, have I done enough for this person that I deserve to receive such a large gift, right? Buying your parents a car or buying your spouse a car, like, that's understandable, because, you've had this long-term relationship. It really depends on the context, I guess. But if it's totally out of context, you have to sort of, I think the indebtedness would be so great that I think, again, coming back to what Jing was saying, it would be hard to articulate exactly what you were feeling. And I think there would be this feeling of like, I don't deserve this. And, probably feelings of, feelings that would be probably negative. Like, this is also part of what we are trying to get at with this, scarcity project that we're working on, is looking at potentially negative impacts that gratitude can have. And I mean, this is another context, right, where you can look at it, because if the receiver perceives the gift as sort of, far exceeding their expectations, then there could be some negative impacts that come into play. Have we lost Alexa? I don't see her.
Well, so I actually have so speaking of your project, so I'm actually really curious if it's kind of individual based, or do you also measure like in-group effects of, a group of individuals, if they feel grateful, is that going to change their behavior as a, or is that going to have much effect for them as a group, as a community versus individuals?
So that's a great point. I mean, at this level, we've only done like a couple of studies and it's very preliminary. And we've just done studies, where we have individuals as subjects. And we sort of, we use a very standard gratitude manipulation, which is we ask them to list 3 things that they're grateful for. And then we prime scarcity, and then we sort of measure their, how indebted they feel and how sort of, reciprocal they feel and stuff. And sort of, how they perceive their resources. And what we find is that basically people who experience resource scarcity, when they experience gratitude, they actually perceive their resources to be even more scarce. So these are sort of, findings so far. But it would be really interesting. And maybe I'm approaching it from a slightly different perspective than what you said, Jing, but what we've been thinking about is sort of people tend to think of their relationships as either communal or transactional. And so some people have this sense that, they don't really keep this mental account of, oh, like I spent $20 on lunch and then this person spent $30 on lunch, so I owe them $10. Like, some people have a very transactional view of their relationships. And some people have this very communal sort of view, like, oh, like it's okay if I spend like $10 more, and it's okay if like this person spends $5 less. Like, it doesn't matter to them. Like these sort of small discrepancies don't really register. And so we want to basically examine like how people who have a transactional view versus people who have a communal view, like how gratitude impacts them. Because assuming that people who have, if people who are more transactional, like they might think more in terms of, well, what is the value of this favor that this person has done to me? And I need to reciprocate with something of similar value. And people who are sort of more communal, they might say, okay, this person's done something nice for me, I'm going to do something nice for them, right? It just is like the value of the favor doesn't really matter, but just like the actual act or the thought, it's the thought that counts, right? It's that kind of mindset. So I don't know if that's what you were referring to, or were you referring to something else when you talked about in-group versus individual?
I thought that was really interesting that, the two mindset would change how we perceive gratitude. But I was actually getting at a different point, which is that if the enhancing, if the promoting of the emotions such as gratitude, is that going to change, let's say, the atmosphere of a whole office, right? Instead of just this one individual's life, because our action, our emotion impact other people, and other people's behavior also impacts us. So I wonder if that's something that will be looked at.
Not as part of my project, but anecdotally, we do have, there are businesses, and most businesses have like an employee of the month or like, employee of the week, and that kind of appreciation kind of intervention. And I guess you could do some sort of quasi like natural experiment where like you compare businesses which have those interventions and businesses that don't have those interventions, and basically compare and see like if there's a difference in morale or like mood or, just overall sort of, because it might also lead to competition, right? Like we are competitive as humans. And so if there's this competition to be employee of the month or employee of the week, then it can also lead to, like maybe the opposite effect, right? Like maybe it sort of leads people to become more competitive and less sort of friendly and more cutthroat. And so that would be really cool actually to see, maybe another sort of, group effect of gratitude, or having these sort of appreciation kind of based interventions could also have, unexpected negative impacts. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I didn't even consider that angle, but that angle is really cool. Yeah. What else?
I thought Alexa may have something to add.
Not necessarily to that point, but what comes to my mind, of course, we're talking about like experimental design or how to test these things, is like, I would be so curious to see, based on these manipulations, based on people's cultural backgrounds, based on their upbringing, what different areas of the brain are actually activated. So what are the cognitive concepts or cognitive mechanisms that are at play when you feel gratitude, and how does that differ based on your background, right? So thinking again that there's this kind of initial recognition of emotion, there's this processing, this moral cognition, and then there's this whole deliberation phase, right, where you kind of weigh, like Tanya said, the value of what you're receiving and what you've contributed, right? So if a neighbor from 3 blocks down shows up and gives me a car, I might not feel super grateful. It might, I might be happy and kind of like, wow, okay, that's really nice, but I might not feel the same way if it's like a parent, like we talked about before, right? So for me, it's kind of interesting to see, which regions of the brain light up. And a lot of this, deliberation has been thought to be related to the medial prefrontal cortex, which in short is the kind of frontal part of your brain, kind of deeper down close to the core. And a lot of this is, these areas are what's responsible for that decision of like, okay, once I thought about this and I weigh the value of what I've contributed to the value of what I'm receiving, I've made that decision. And then I really either feel grateful or kind of feel uncomfortable about that. So what comes to me is thinking like, with all this complexity in there, I'd love to see people in a scanner in this and see, well, really what comes up and how can you manipulate different things and see how that changes which areas are lit up, so to speak, or what the process is for each person based on all these different factors.
So this might bring us back to a little bit to the beginning of our conversation. I'm really curious because Alexa was talking about the physiological aspect of gratitude. I'm curious, like what causes, what in your study or in your understanding, what do you think would cause gratitude or that feeling? And then also, do you think there is a specific or general formula for that? Or do you think that's just a very, personal, whoever, people will be grateful for whatever they are grateful of? So I'm really curious of that.
I don't know if there is like a formula or a specific way of conceptualizing what really is like behind the scenes when someone feels grateful or feels gratitude. What I found so far in kind of looking more into it in preparation for today was that it's really complex, right? And you have to be able to recognize emotion, right? So first there's like all that recognition of emotion. There seems to be some things that are well understood and some factors that all kind of intertwine to lead someone to feel grateful for something. But it's not fully understood in terms of, well, is that the same for everyone? Is it different based on cultural or upbringing? And that is something I keep bringing up because when I did the research in children, right, I was really curious, like, what is it in children? Like, why don't they feel grateful the same way younger adults do? And why does it change again in older adulthood? Again, lifespan researcher. And a lot of the work in children was really based in their environment or their cultural background. So there's studies like gratefulness in children in the US, gratefulness in children in Guatemala, gratefulness, and there's all these, like, it's very specific by region or by culture. And what was interesting to me is that may play a huge factor as well. So all this rambling to say that I don't think there's a specific formula to it, but there seems to be like slowly piecing it together to really understand, well, what is it that's contributing to this really complex emotion on the psychological angle?
Can you name a few of the factors that would contribute to it? Something like a person receives something, right? So that's probably one part of it, that some kind of perceived gain from, another party who maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally have, benefited the other.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about like a gift giving context that elicits gratitude, there would be kind of that gift or that gain on the behalf of the receiver, right? So I've gained something, I've recognized that I've gained something, then I have an emotional reaction to that, right? Which takes for granted that there's an emotional maturity or an emotional understanding, right, on the behalf of the receiver. So when you think of very young children, they might not fully understand what it is they're feeling yet if they don't have that developed. And then you can think of, okay, now that that's passed, there's all this, moral cognition. So like, I've received this person's gift. Well, what does that mean? And what do I do next? And then there's this whole deliberation process of the value. So, okay, well, what is it they gave me? Is it worth a lot? Is it not worth a lot? How much did I return in terms of either material or time or, in any way back to this person? So there's all these kind of little pieces, and they all rely on a certain amount of development. So even just one of the big factors I found really interesting that contributes to this, I found was theory of mind. So this ability to understand that what I know, not everyone else knows. What I have, not everyone else has. And that makes total sense that it would be involved in being grateful, right? I know that maybe not everyone has a roof over their head. Well, I'm grateful that I do. And maybe I always did, right? It's not because I eventually didn't have a roof over my head that I can express or feel gratitude or grateful for having that. So I think those are all these little pieces that come together. And then because these different cognitive developmental abilities change from childhood to young adulthood to older adulthood, then we can see how that might affect gratitude or how it's expressed as well.
I wonder, so one other factor that came to my mind, maybe Tanya can help us out later, was the some of the factor too, is a sense of entitlement, right? So what I am entitled to, maybe, my parents, when I was younger, if maybe my parents providing me with a room and a meal, I wasn't very much grateful for that because, I just felt like that's what they're supposed to do. They're my parents, right? Well, as if my aunt cooked me a meal, I am very grateful because that's not her job in my mind, right? Maybe now I look at things very differently because now I understand how hard it is actually to cook for someone. So I'm really grateful for my mom's cooking in case she's watching for some reason, but for the record. But I think there's a sense of, whether I am entitled to something. And it's easier for us to feel grateful for things that we thought we're not entirely entitled to, right? Because if we thought it's ours, we don't really, if we tend to take something for ours or for granted, then obviously we don't feel very much grateful about it.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this as well when Alexa was talking, that, like when you think about the antecedents of gratitude, I mean, definitely, yes, there's gift giving and, there's sort of acts of kindness and things like that we perceive as, as benefits that we've received and that we should be grateful for. But I think I was also thinking, along the lines of what Jing was saying, that sometimes even negative events can sort of can trigger gratitude, right? So if I have a near-death experience, right? If I'm almost in a car crash, like immediately following that, I'll be like, oh my God, thank God I'm alive, right? Like, thank God, like I didn't die, right? Like, so there's this gratitude, but it comes from a sort of, a sort of bad experience, right? It comes from sort of almost dying or almost like, having a terrible accident or almost like something. And so, and even when we think of, the context of our parents or our relationships, a lot of things that we feel like we're entitled to or that we take for granted, when we lose those things, that's when we feel like, oh my God, I'm so thankful that I had that when I did. Like, I'm so glad that my parents, like provided me with a room and provided me with 3 square meals a day and, like gave me like, all the, like, gave me birthday presents and stuff. Because when you don't have those things, when you lack those things, that's when you sort of tend to. So, I mean, memory, like, looking at pictures that sort of remind you of past events, that can also serve as a sort of gratitude reminder, but also, like losing things in your life can surprisingly have this effect of, of engendering gratitude, which I find actually fascinating. And yeah, I mean, something that I didn't think about. And I mean, obviously, like gratitude plays an evolutionary role in society, right? Like it is responsible. It's one of the moral motivators of altruism and pro-sociality, right? So it exists because it it sort of allows us to live in a community where we have these communal exchange sort of relationships, right? That are not based on money or that are basically based on goodwill, right? And we need that to function as a society. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's how I think about it. And I mean, I don't think that my research gets into like sort of antecedents of gratitude, but I think definitely there could be some really interesting antecedents of gratitude. And I don't know enough about the research on gratitude to know the extent of the antecedents, but it does seem like, yeah, that could be a really ripe area for research. The other thing that I was thinking of as Alexa was speaking about sort of, the areas of the brain that light up when we experience gratitude is like, yeah, and I think she sort of mentioned this, it largely depends on cultural context. So in cultures have different social norms. And so, like in North America, we're conditioned to sort of, in emails, write like, thank you, and I appreciate this, and, and almost to the point that it's sort of automated, right? It's like we're on autopilot sort of writing those things and being polite. And so then, I mean, I wonder, like, when you do these fMRI kind of analyses, like if you look at people who come from cultures where there's this social conditioning to basically just, say thank you for everything, versus when you actually, look at cultures like, I think in India, like, when you say thank you, I think you really sort of want to mean that you sort of, you experience that gratitude and you feel really thankful for someone. And there's a lot of like physicality as well, right? So it's like in Indian culture, it's like you really hug people and you say, oh my God, thank you so much for doing this for me. And I think North America, like, it's sort of more like, we're not that, I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I'm just saying in general, there is a sense that, you sort of like, you respect the other person's privacy and space a lot more. And I think that that is sort of different across cultures. And so I also wonder, like, how those social norms and that social conditioning would impact, the areas of the brain that light up. Just a thought to add to Alexa's sort of comment.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I know, like, from my own childhood, I was very conditioned by my parents to say thank you, and if you don't, you get kind of an elbow in the ribs and, oh, okay, I didn't say thank you. And it wasn't necessarily something I said, it wasn't necessarily a hug. I wouldn't necessarily approach the person, but, even something like you're at the ice cream shop and the person has you taste an extra flavor. You would say thank you. It's not the same thank you that I would say to someone who really helped me out of a difficult situation, but we're conditioned to say thank you. And what I guess, like, kind of just echoing what you said, I wonder if that affects differently as we age, to see, well, am I maybe less grateful than someone else who would have not been cued or conditioned to say thank you for smaller things as well, Or is that just kind of all beneficial in the long term? And given its relationship to well-being and subjective well-being in the individual who's feels the gratitude, is that also something that would play a role here? Saying thank you for that little extra spoon of ice cream makes me feel good too. And that can also be something that would be interesting to look into in this whole kind of cultural differences idea.
I think, actually, I recently read a book that's called The Wrong of Rudeness. It's by a philosopher who worked on virtue ethics and Confucian philosophy. And then I think it's very much along the line of what Alexa was saying earlier. She argues that, but she doesn't talk about it in terms of gratitude. She talks about it in terms of politeness and manners. And then her idea is that if we just have good manners, like saying thank you, even when we don't wholeheartedly mean that we're very, very grateful for that, for your service of giving me a scoop of ice cream, which I'm paying for. But I think the idea is that it signals our sociality. It signals that we have this receptive and openness to form a further social interaction with people. So, but I thought at one point in the last exchange that I noticed that was really, really of interest to me is the bodily aspect of gratitude that Tanya had just mentioned. Because a lot of times it's not just simply writing the words or uttering the words. A lot of times, in different cultures, showing gratitude is coupled with all kinds of bodily bodily posture and the specific manners, the specific rituals, right? You thank someone, by having different gestures, right? In East Asian cultures, in Indian cultures, in different cultures. And I think even though the gestures and the bodily postures are not the same, but there's a sense of, you signaling that you are willing to take a lower position than the other person, right? So even if I'm taller, I want to bow down a little bit to show that I let you take the taller space in this room. And then, so there is some kind of like yielding like gesture that's going on there. So I think there to signal that we are experiencing, we're acknowledging something that has done to us. So, and I think that's one thing I mentioned in our pre-podcast discussion as well, which is the bodily aspect. How and can that be factored into a lab setting or the survey setting, right? So even if it's just cases where a person have to, maybe put themselves in a bodily posture that's frequently associated with showing gratitude, and then think about the things that they are grateful of, right? Rather than just sit in front of the desk, think, okay, 5 things I'm grateful of. But anyways, just a thought.
No, that's very interesting, Jing. I mean, it's really interesting that you bring up, because in Indian culture, there is this, there is this bowing, and there is this sort of, and I think in sort of Chinese culture as well, there is this bowing, and there's this sort of acknowledgement that, and I wonder like what you think of that, right? Like, because, to me, it's like, it almost signals like an indebtedness, right? Like, I'm indebted to you, like you've done something good for me, and I am sort of, showing you that I'm indebted to you. And I wonder how you interpreted that, and how you think that sort of like, what sort of moral philosophy has to say about that? Like, what does the bodily posture indicate?
I think there's a connection between our beliefs, our mental state, our emotion, and as well as our, physical state, right? Bodily gesture. So obviously, in empirical study, you're familiar with that. And in philosophy, in some of the non-Western traditions, it's also very prominent that all these things are really very much connected, right? So in Western philosophy, in the rationalistic tradition, sometimes we think that the most important thing happens here, right? But there are a lot of different traditions, as well as empirical studies seem to suggest does not happen here. It happens all over in our body, right? Our decision making and our feelings. So I do think that the bodily exercise and the bodily gesture, it's closely associated with our feelings, and our feelings emotions are extremely important in certain senses, because if we just bow down, or if we just do something without actually feeling it, or if we just say something without actually feeling it, that's not necessarily that's not really doing. So I think in daily communication, sometimes it's okay for us to have the gesture, but not always have the emotion coupling it. But ideally, at least in some circumstances, they are all supposed to be there, so they can mutually, enforce each other, because they are supposed to be there together. So I think it's a very important area to look into, and it is something that a lot of times the theorists would neglect, that the bodily aspect of a value of a practice. So yeah. So I don't know if we can move to another topic that we brought up earlier that I'm extremely interested in, which is that I think when Tanya mentioned, if something, let's say if I just had a near-death experience, and then then I am so grateful that I'm alive, right? So I think that can become as our illusion of that we are entitled to our life has been shattered, right? We know we can't take it for granted. And then, the family member, the parents who make our beds or every day, now we realize, no, we don't owe them or owe their connection forever. That will go away sometime. So there is a sense of entitlement, and we realize we can't have that entitlement. But this also reminds me of a very, very controversial topic a while ago, which is called poverty tourism, right? So you take the kids or you take young adults to, some places where people were struggling and people experiencing scarcity in severe levels. And then, you expect the young adults or the child to say, oh, now I appreciate what I have. And I'm going to, behave better or something like that, right? So I wonder if there's, obviously this is highly controversial, right? But I wonder if this kind of like sudden realization or sudden, shattering of the sense of entitlement, that kind of gratitude caused by this would have similar or the same motivating power as the kind of gratitude where a person feel, something has been bestowed or given to me out of goodwill, and I feel, at some point this kind of, and I feel someone was being nice and being kind to me, and I feel like at some point I should return that person or someone else the favor.
That's really interesting to me. One thing, just like, again, this I don't think is based in any research I've read, but just kind of thinking through this, it feels like those moments, having experienced them myself, where you travel and you see kind of extreme poverty, you feel really grateful, but it's not necessarily something that lasts, right? Because it's something that comes from the external world. At least this is my kind of interpretation of it, is that you're really grateful in the moment. You might get kind of this immediate and very intense feeling of being grateful for what you have in that moment, but once you go back home, it might not last, right? It could, but it's not something that would maybe last as long as if it came from inside of you, so if it was internalized before, right? So feeling grateful for what your parents have provided to you on your own without having to have that external reminder, maybe kind of a different type or a different expression of gratitude than when we get it from this kind of external cue that makes us have this kind of sudden realization that we're very grateful for the things we have. Not sure if that provides anything of value, but I thought that I would say it, given that it kind of, I see them as maybe slightly different here as when it comes from kind of the internal thought process.
Yeah, thank you, Alexa. I think it does sort of add insight, and thank you, Jing, for bringing that up, because I think it raises a really interesting point. As you said, do these very different antecedents of gratitude have the same sort of downstream consequences, right? So are they the same kind of motivators in terms of things that we want to do? And I don't know if this is a complete answer or a good answer or a bad answer, but I think that one of the factors that might contribute to how these sort of affect how the downstream consequences play out might be sort of, the individual who's experiencing the gratitude, like their own sort of personality. So, like the amount of empathy that they generally feel. So if I am experiencing, if I go to a poor country and I see, people struggling, if I'm a really empathetic person, if I am an empath, that might motivate me to do something for them, right? That might motivate me to say, oh, I really wish I could do something for these people and improve their lives. But if I'm not a generally empathetic person, then it might just come back to me and I might say, well, I'm in a much better position than these people, and maybe I should try to make my life, I should appreciate my life more. So I think that maybe there's a moderator there, which is sort of an individual difference, which might be, an individual's own, gratitude has also been measured as a trait, right? So some people have more of a tendency to feel gratitude, and some people have less of a tendency to feel gratitude. So maybe that's another sort of potential moderator there. The other thing that I was feeling, Jing, because you really sort of, I think, again, really pinpointed this really interesting area, which is that, when your illusion of your entitlement of is sort of broken, that's when the gratitude sort of sometimes kicks in. So, the illusion of I'm life is owed to me, and I'm sort of, I'm going to be, alive till I'm 80 or whatever. But then I was wondering in terms of Alexa's research, because she focuses on sort of aging and lifespan, as people grow older, they realize that their days are sort of, like they have less and less time, and they have less and less sort of, maybe cognitive resources or, money or whatever. And that should then increase the amount of gratitude that they feel, right? So I should be more grateful for every day that I'm alive, for every day that I get to spend with my family, so is there sort of, this enhancement of gratitude as you grow older because of the realization that you have less and less time and that you have less and less, or I don't know, is it that, I don't know, can it go in the other direction, right? So that's another question that came into my mind. And I don't know if Alexa, if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, what I found, and again, there's definitely tons of individual differences just because of the sheer complexity of this, but the general trend is that as we age, we tend to be more and more grateful for what we currently have and what we've had over the course of our lifespan. Now, this could be, kind of like you said, there's fewer days remaining, but there's also so much experience, right? There's so much you can look back to and be grateful for, regardless of what that past looks like, just because you've lived for longer. So there is this trend to feel more grateful as we age. So comparing kind of at a group level, the young adults to older adults tend to be more grateful. What I thought was super interesting is that there's a strong correlation or covariance with, I've lost my term, subjective well-being. And that correlation between subjective well-being and gratitude was constant across the lifespan. So it seems to, be related to how we feel and our well-being across the lifespan, regardless of age, but nevertheless increases over time. So I think maybe it is somewhat related to this temporal aspect of, you have more to look back onto, and you have maybe, you're realizing that you're getting to the end of your lifespan. But it's kind of all still being worked out in the literature, to what I found anyways.
Yeah, I think that really makes sense. Sometimes I have my parents or grandparents saying, "Oh, you're so young," right? And I did not know that's something to be grateful about. I just thought, being young sucks, right? So what is so great about it? But obviously, but I think I think I want to go back to what Tanya was saying about the poverty tourism. I thought that was a very interesting turn there. So if a person experiencing this surge of emotion, and if the focus is on the other people, right, who are suffering, then what you experience becomes sympathy or empathy, right? You want to help those people, right? But if the focus of the emotion is on yourself, then it becomes, oh, what am I experiencing is that I realize that what I have is very, hard to, it's probably a result of sheer luck, and I should appreciate it more. So, which kind of led me to the limitation of the emotion of gratitude, because it's essentially a self-focused emotion, right? It's that, someone did something for me, or I realize I don't have something, right? It's kind of like a self-focused emotion. And then, of course, you don't have to only have gratitude. You can have gratitude and empathy together when you're in a situation like that, right? But just speaking conceptually of the emotion of gratitude, it's really a self-focused emotion of what others or what the world has done to me, maybe something nice, right? Something good. So I wonder if for someone who is, let's say, really prone to experience gratitude, does it also kind of reviews a very, maybe a very self-centered or self-focused way of thinking or of feeling emotions? So that's my question.
I mean, that's a great question. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it makes sense from what you say that it is, you're right, that it is sort of something that we reflect on within ourselves, right? Like, yes, this person did something for me, unless it's, someone doing something for your family. But even then, it's just, this sort of immediate extension of yourself, right? So it's usually, or it's in a group setting, but usually gratitude is sort of, usually focused on one person, and it is experienced, like you said, within oneself. So, I mean, it would be really cool to see if there are sort of correlations between high levels of being able to experience gratitude and also high levels of egocentrism or, high levels of sort of self-focus. Yeah, so that would be really interesting because that represents another dark side of gratitude, as you said. So we're realizing as we come to, as our conversation is sort of wrapping up, I think, because time is coming to a close, that gratitude, is at the beginning, we sort of said, it's very complex, as Alexa said, and now we're sort of realizing that, yes, there are potentially many sort of, and negative consequences of gratitude if we start to examine it from these sort of different perspectives. And yeah, it's we've definitely raised some really, really interesting questions. Hopefully, these are things that we can, in the course of our own research, try and unpack, or, hopefully, give other people who are interested in gratitude a direction that, maybe they can pursue research in. So yeah, I hope that it's useful to people. And I just wanted to add that, during the pandemic, because Jing brought up this point that, this illusion of we're going to live forever has been shattered, right? Because basically we were like, we might get COVID at any point and die. And so we've all, I think, become cognizant of, how fragile life is, and we've become more grateful. And I don't know if you personally have reflected on it or if you have any comments. So maybe we can just close with that.
Yeah. So maybe I'll go first. Here is still, I think, related to the distinction that I'm really trying to push for, which is that one is kind of like a self-learning process, right? I'm readjusting my framework of life, whether I'm going to live forever or, I can't really take all these things for granted, right? So this kind of self-learning process of gratitude that we have. On the other hand, there's also the kind of gratitude we have for very specific people, for very specific things. And I do think that both are great feelings and both can be very helpful. But I do think sometimes maybe a distinction of which one is actually more helpful, the more general abstract one, for my existence or for the sun, for the, weather, or something more specific that's more helpful. But I think I will end with this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I can just add, like you mentioned, during the pandemic, there was a lot of, wow, you realizing that you're grateful for so much more than you realize you are on a day-to-day basis, right? You're kind of faced with this negative emotion of, oh, I'm fearful of getting sick. I'm grateful I'm currently not sick, or I'm currently in good health. And that does feel like a selfish thing to go through. But I think what's interesting to think about, and kind of bringing this other side back to gratitude, is that there is some positive too. You think about yourself and how you're grateful for these things, and now it makes you somehow feel more socially connected with the people around you. When you share this gratefulness, you share these happy moments, you are very well, you're very happy, and this allows you to connect with others once again. So although I think there's this kind of selfishness there, maybe if we think about how we deal with gratitude on our own side, we talk about this gratitude at a larger level, being grateful for the weather, for our health, and for our family and friends. There's this way of, it has a way of connecting us all together. So I think there's a lot of complexity here, and it's overall, I think that the pandemic has its good sides and bad sides. And when it comes to gratitude, I think I've experienced both the selfless and selfish part of it.
A conversation for part two. I don't know if you. Thank you so much, the three of you, Tanya, Jing, and Alexa. Tanya, thank you for allowing us to challenge you in your research by suggesting that you speak with people across disciplines about this idea and this concept. I hope that it was helpful and interesting for all of you. And of course, on our end, every conversation is an interesting one to have here at ForSpace. We're so happy to be able to host you in this way. And as I mentioned, the intent of this recording was really to produce a podcast. So we will be editing down this hour-long moment to something like 20 minutes and re-releasing it across our channels with your approval, of course. So for those of you listening on YouTube, thanks for being here. And we will, like I say, you'll have a chance to really live the highlights of today's conversations as something you can take on a walk with you on a podcast. Okay, so once again, thank you all for participating. Thank you for joining us in the space, Alexa. This is great to have you here. And Jing and Tanya, it's so great that you're able to meet us across time zones and across cities and so on. So thanks again. On that note, we'll close up. So we'll look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks, Sal.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Anna, again for facilitating. And thank you, Jing, for participating. And thank you, Alexa, for making the trek and going to campus and being there to represent us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Great conversation. I've learned a lot, like last time.
Yes, it was really, really fun. Thanks again.
Awesome. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.